This is The Great State Mural, Mongolia Portrayed, our bi-weekly podcast that analyzes the current developments and deeper structures and the joys of contemporary Mongolia. My name is Anand Tumurtaga. I'm a journalist based in Ulaanbaatar.
And I am Dolgan Aldar. I'm a development and researcher professional currently based in Phnom Penh.
This is Julian Deckes, and I am affiliated with the University of Mannheim in Germany.
So, in this episode's three universals are the three indices. The index of pointing variety, the index of the book variety, and the index of measuring variety. So in this episode, dear listener, we'll be talking about the indices. Just recently, in mid-March of 2026, an edition of the VDEM Democracy Index was released. It was interesting to me to see that now the most people live in autocracies, namely 74% now live in autocracies, while only 26% reside in democracies. In South and Central Asia, only 2% of people enjoy an electoral democracy. In Nepal and Sri Lanka, a small portion resides in the gray zone democracies, and those are Bhutan, the Maldives, and Mongolia. A vast majority, 85%, live in electoral autocracies such as India, Kazakhstan, and Pakistan. Closed autocracies such as Afghanistan, Turkmenistan now account for 13% of the population, with Bangladesh descending into this category in 2025. So, today we're asking, how democratic is Mongolia really at this point? What different indices tell us? What do they measure? What do they miss? And how should we interpret these indices? That go?
Yeah, a really big question. But maybe before we try to answer this question, I could provide a brief overview of what these kind of democracy indices say about Mongolia. One thing I do a lot when I travel abroad or in international conferences and talking about Mongolia, I always show not the VDEM index, but the Freedom House index on purpose. Because the Freedom House index classifies Mongolia as free, and it looks quite impressive on the map because all surrounding neighbors look red, which means not free, and Mongolia looks green or blue, free. So that's a bit biased, and I selected on purpose. Whereas the VDEM index, that you just described, Mongolia is a great democracy or a democracy that is on the brink of turning to grey autocracy and further decline. So we're kind of clinging on there. So in terms of the Freedom House index, what we see is that from early 1990s, when the country was transitioning, it gained the status of free country quite soon, quickly, because loads of reforms were happening. And around 2000, it became generally stable, but stayed relatively at a higher level compared to other countries. And starting from 2010s, 2020s, we're still free, but we see gradual decline in our scoring. And the reports generally highlight issues around corruption, governance, and political issues. Similar trend is observed in the VDEM index as well. When we look at least, there are loads of different categories, but if we see, for example, the liberal democracy index, we see that 1990s was sudden jump compared to the baseline of the autocratic regime. Then 2010s, it started dropping a bit, and then we know that in 2024, it made into headlines, in Mongolia at least, that, oh my God, Mongolia is an electoral autocracy now. So that made a huge...
I like electrical autocracy better. Let's establish that somehow.
Our new term for Mongolia's autocratic tendencies. And as you wrote recently, Julian, in your article on Mongolia Focus, in 2025, we barely made it back to the kind of electoral democracy league, But to what extent this up and down and this switch between 2024 and 2025 is significant is, of course, an issue that we can discuss today. Broadly, we can see that around 2010s, democracy has stalled in terms of quality and in terms of depth. And around 2020s, it started declining more rapidly, and also reflecting international trend, I guess. So I want to ask you, Julian, we know that you are one of the experts scoring these things on VDEM index, filling out those questionnaires. So tell us, and also you studied democracy in depth in your academic work. So can you tell us a bit more about what is the origin of these indices, what they're trying to do, and how we should interpret them, and what do you see, especially in recent years, these changes and fluctuations in Mongolia's indices?
Yes, I am totally delighted to, in part because, as you mentioned, I'm involved with VDEM, but I also was involved with Freedom House for many years until last year. So I know both of those processes from the inside. Just to preview a little bit, the bottom line on these indices, and part of what we're trying to do is you have to understand what purpose they're serving and how they work if you're going to use them, if you're going to refer to them and use them otherwise. And so to enable listeners a little bit to do that, just a little bit of background. Indices have really taken off in the 2000s. Historically, maybe the granddaddy of them all was the UNDP, the Human Development Index, although Freedom House has also been going for a long time. But they took off in the 2000s, or starting in the 1990s, and have become a little bit of a fashion that maybe has receded a little bit, but I still get requests from indices I've never heard of before for a Mongolia score. So the fashion seems to still be running. I would link to this fashionableness, I would link a little bit to the international focus on accountability that sort of started with the Reagan-Thatcher political movement in the 80s. So indices are meant to provide a measure, a benchmark by which we can look at government's actions, right? They're not a judgment on a country so much as on the success of governments in achieving goals that they may have set out for themselves.
I think this really links to the broader movement in the 80s where Thatcher and the new public management approach, which tries to link everything with performance, with results, and to know they're performing, governments are performing, they need to measure it, and to measure it, they started focusing on these indices, right?
So from an international perspective, that's exactly right. If you're a donor nation, if you think in terms of cooperation and development aid, for example, some of the demands were, wait, if we're investing in, for example, democratization in Mongolia, as donors, we would like to see results. So things should improve, and they should improve measurably. Also, though, as a citizen, say, for example, of Mongolia, maybe this is a measure or benchmark by which you want to hold your government accountable when you go to vote, right? If you go to a parliamentary election and you meet your candidates, if you have a chance to, and you say, hey, look, you talked about democracy 4 years ago, and I see this index, nothing has changed. What's going on? What's not happening? So it's meant to provide that accountability both on a domestic level and on an international level. All kinds of questions about whether that actually happens or not, and whether that's realistic to expect and what that means. But that's sort of the origin. The other piece, I think, that accounts for the popularity or the fashionableness. League tables are really easy to understand for everyone in the world. Saying Mongolia is ranked the 61st country in the world out of 193 countries, people think that they understand what that means. And it's easy to communicate. And all of Anand's colleagues, namely journalists, can phrase easy headlines out of that, saying, oh, Mongolia's gone up 10 points. It's like watching soccer. You say, all right, are we number 5 in the league or are we number 4? which is easy to do for a soccer league because you have scored goals and points won by winning matches, much harder to do for democracy. But that's part of I think the popularity as well is that this is actually a metric or a way to describe the state of something. We're talking mostly about democracy today, to the public, to say this is where everything's at. And that's why these indices, I think overall, have taken off. There's also in the background to all of this, and this is particularly prominent for VDEM, there is also a real need for this kind of index in social science. If you are a comparative social scientist and you are interested in, for example, pension systems, and you have a specific question about how a particular pension system works, and you're trying to answer that question by running a large, many-country quantitative model, then an obvious explanation for how pension systems work, for example, for how inclusive they are. I'm just sort of making up questions on the fly. But if you want to ask how inclusive a pension system is, you need some measure of democracy in there, because presumably greater political participation will lead to greater inclusiveness of a pension system. And so as social scientists, there are many models that we're very interested in using to explain things that require some kind of a snapshot, continuous variable, ideally, of something like democracy and many other things that people measure. And so one of the things that VDEM is particularly prominent for, that it's a very academic exercise, and it's a hugely developed methodology, in part because it is designed for other social scientists to plug in various composite indices that come out of VDEM, for example, the 5 sub-indices for democracy, into models where this is a relevant control variable. So primarily, right? So in those social science terms, the interest is primarily in control variables rather than in outcomes. So the index is probably not used to explain democracy, but democracy as a factor is used to explain something else in that world. It's a little bit complicated, but just to give as a background. So far, so good?
So far, so good. How much do, let's say a media reporting comes into play in terms of these indexes? Do they play a prominent role? Let's say a journalist writes a piece about how let's say the president is trying to take over the judiciary. Would that contribute to the indices in some way?
Interesting question. The interplay with media is much more important for some indices than others. And the reason that is, and this is a question I would urge all listeners to always ask of indices, who pays? It's almost always a good question to ask in anything involved in politics. Take an example, Freedom House, who produce Freedom in the World. They are a donations-driven body. They were, in their origins, maybe received more governmental funding, but have increasingly focused towards donation-driven. This is foundations, but also individuals, as an example. So to them, media resonance is an important feature in donation drives, right? They need the public to recognize that they do an important job because they're hoping for the public to support their work. That is a little bit less the case for an academic project like VDEM, which ultimately is supported by primarily government funds that are research funds and that don't really take media echo or media resonance into account. So just very broadly speaking, if we just compare these two, for Freedom House, the fact that journalists refer to their index is an important part of how they try to fund their activities, whereas I'm sure VDEM is not offended by good reporting on outcomes, but that is probably not a real part of what they do necessarily to think about. They do want to communicate to the public, but it's not a core, I don't think.
And also, I think many of the indices are developed and disseminated by various think tanks that are themselves also have particular ideologies. For example, the Heritage Foundation in the US, they are very kind of libertarian, so they produce the Liberty Index, which obviously favors and sees anything to do with liberty as the kind of moral and value, more like important values that we should be measuring. So I think, as you say, Julian, looking at who pays and also what's the political agenda behind these organizations or centers that produce these indices is very important to kind of consider when interpreting these results.
Totally agree, right? There are some indices that are actually consensus-based. Take the Human Development Index from UNDP. Because it comes out of the UN system, presumably there's some kind of an endorsement at the UN level that all countries are interested in this. That's not to say that all individual aspects are agreed to, right? But there's a sort of a basis to this that says, yes, we think human development, as measured by the Human Development Index, is a good thing. And so providing accountability on these metrics is generally agreed to as a good activity. Just a side note, we're not going to talk about the Human Development Index much, but it is a very different kind of index because it's official statistics based. It draws on whatever the National Statistical Office in Mongolia reports to the UN, and that's how that index is compiled. So it's a very different beast. But and I would argue something like democracy, elements in VDEM, but also in Freedom House, are drawing on the UN Charter. And so that is presumed to be a global consensus. However, as we all know, even though many countries have signed up to fundamental rights, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're as supportive as others. And then there are things that, like you just mentioned, Torbjörn, like Heritage Foundation, where there's a particular angle on an issue. And so I think almost all indices are built around a positive goal, what they think of as a positive goal, right? So there are very few indices that say, that endorse corruption and provide the ranking in terms of, yeah, you won the corruption leagues, right? Or that endorse violence or something like that. They tend to be constructed around what the constructors at least think of as a positive outcome.
Well, would you say that the VDEM is then one of the better indices in terms of measuring like democracy? And yeah, I'll lead that with that, and I have some few other points to make.
It is a very careful, because of its academic roots, it's a very careful and elaborate effort to try to measure things that are difficult to measure as precisely as possible. So I think that was a long answer to say that, yes, for particular purposes, for example, if you want democracy, various versions of democracy, or all the other things that VDEM measures, because it's big, it's not just democracy, right? But if you need a control variable in a large model that gives you some assessment of the state of democracy, then I would say it's the best in the business. But that's a very specific purpose.
But do you guys see that maybe that, like, as we see the numbers, mainly the global south is not doing very so well in terms of the indices, but if you maybe like look at towards the US now, things are not doing very well in the US in terms of the democracy. But I would say they would probably rank better than like China, for example. But China, in my eyes, is probably doing far better than in terms of giving well-beings towards their citizens. But I would say that on an index level, they would look poorly compared to America. And so along with it, a question would be like, does these indices are biased towards the global south in some capacity?
Yeah, I just out of curiosity, using the Mongolia Focus list of, you had like 32 index global indices listed there, which also includes Mongolia. And a quick AI search gave me the answer that out of these 32, 31 were headquartered in the global north, so somewhere like the Europe, US, Australia, etc. Only one in the global south, which is the Civicus Monitor in South Africa, which is also relatively more like aligned to, let's say, the Western ideology. One interesting thing, based on my experience, to answer Anand's question, is just not really related to democracy index itself, but on, let's say, subjective well-being, social well-being. There's a famous index, I think, happiness index. And in recent years, it became very trendy. Even in Mongolia, I noticed loads of media outlets report on it. Mongolians' average happiness score is this. We rank this. And actually, myself and a few colleagues in Mongolia, we initiated an index in Mongolia on subjective well-being, which looks beyond happiness. Happiness is only one indicator, and we also look at things like satisfaction, future like prospects, outlook, etc. And the argument is that why everyone needs to chase happiness across the globe. Each culture is different. Some cultures maybe value peace and calmness as opposed to happiness, constant happiness. Other cultures maybe prefer more like harmony with their society and being part of, etc. So, as you mentioned correctly, many of these global north-driven indices, of course, by default, measure more things that are convenient for them to measure, in my opinion. And not many Asian-driven indices exist so far that I know of. We do say we contextualize this in our own home country, but not really. We do change maybe the scale of answers, etc., but not really the fundamental ideology behind it. And one example, a funny example I had in relevant to China, I was in DC in 2020 about to deliver a public presentation on Mongolia's democracy, actually. And it was at the National Endowment of Democracy. And I used one indicator called World Governance Indicators, Worldwide Governance Indicators by the World Bank, which measures not just freedom, etc., but more like government effectiveness and efficiency. And in this indicator, China and Russia were very high in terms of government effectiveness. They're able to deliver if they say they want to do something. And I was going to include it in my presentation, and my advisor there really opposed it. And he was like, why you shouldn't say like something positive about Russia and China. So we had a huge debate about it just before my presentation, like behind the scene, like a few minutes. So I found that quite interesting. There's a really strong push back against recognizing some of the things that Russia and China are doing well.
Just a heads up to our listeners, please consider subscribing to the podcast to stay up to date on new episodes. Please rate and review us on whatever platform you're listening on. It makes the podcast easier to find for others. We would like to improve the production, the quality of the podcast, so please support us at buymecoffee.com/GreatStateMural to contribute to that aspiration. Apart from your podcast app, you can find more information about us, how to support, how to comment, and more information on other episodes at agulamedia.com/podcast. Now back to the show.
Wow, big question. I don't even know where to start. Yes, fundamentally, the indices reflect the agenda-setting hegemony of the global north. No question. But come on. Yeah, the US has been tanked. If you look at Freedom House, the US is tanked. But China has never made it. And Anand, you're not really telling me that China scores high on democracy, right? You're saying well-being, but that's not the democracy index. That's a different index. And yeah, the government effectiveness is one of those, Dorgun, right? Where maybe by some measure they do score high, but with the caveat that if you are a Democrat, and I believe many Mongolians to be Democrats, then in the trade-off between effectiveness and political participation, many people will choose political participation. And that's where I would also push back on a presentation that emphasizes government effectiveness, which is a common line out of Beijing, but it comes at the cost of lack of participation. But Anand is ready to jump in.
So I remember reading an op-ed from a Chinese ambassador who was stationed in Bangladesh, and his argument was that the Western idea of democracy is different from what the Chinese prescribe, and that people should not pigeonhole democracy from a Western standpoint.
Okay, but come on, Anand, bullshit. Right? Repression, even if you dress up repression, but what's the saying? You can't put lipstick on a pig, right? If you dress up repression and claim that it's just a different notion of democracy, that is a perversion of notions of democracy. And just by the way, not one that I don't think Mongolians subscribe to.
No, I don't believe it also, but again, it has some grain of truth. Is that who sets the norm of what democracy is? That is the big question.
Absolutely, right? And that's where I'd be the first to say, right, the indices do reflect what I just called the agenda-setting hegemony of the global north, that the terms have been set. Now, you might say, I think there's a legitimate argument for democracy to be a universal value. I would be delighted to enter into that conversation. And so I do think a fair bit of some measure of opportunities to participate in shaping their own lives for citizens, to me, are a universal good. Some of the things that you mentioned, Dolgan, there's lots of debate, right? There's lots of ways where some kind of an idea of social harmony may be preferable. This is also, you could imagine an ugly version, to me, ugly version of that argument being some Chinese argument for democracy, right? Oh, it's so much better to be harmonious, and that way everyone can be happy. Well, except for they don't actually get to decide what they're going to be happy about. But totally on board with, it would be good to have more global discussions on the applicability of some of these goals to all national situations. I'm not willing to budge much on democracy, but there's many other issues I'm totally willing to have conversations about. And I agree with your assessment that the indices reflect broader global discourses and thus reflect the hegemonic position of the global north in setting the agenda.
I have a question for, let's say, so last year, we all know that there was a big protest in Mongolia where the previous government, Oyudin's cabinet, was basically overthrown by youth protests, like Gen Z protests. So that is I would say a sign of a good democracy. But even though these protests accomplished what they've set out for, I still have not seen that this was reflected in the indices. Why is that? Why these kind of movements or push towards democratic activities are not part of these indices?
So this gets to the methodology of the indices. The first thing I would say, none of the prevalent indices are very good at mapping meaningful change year to year. I'm I have in the past, and I'm sometimes asked to give assessments of a year-to-year change. And one could do the just right now, some of the questions are around VDEM, where suddenly we have an uptick on all indicators for democracy for Mongolia, right? So there are questions that result from the way that indices are presented because they're annual, and then people are asking, what is this annual change? My advice to most people looking at these is to look at a 5 or 10-year span. That's where the change becomes meaningful. So I think the fact that all the 5 sub-indicators for democracy for Mongolia and VDEM are up since last year, maybe some of the experts have judged that the protest you describe and the relative success of protesters to make a government move is a change in the nature of democracy. Not a fundamental change, but an incremental change. And thus, indicators have gone up. That's a plausible explanation for that uptick. But keep in mind that is a pretense of precision that none of these indices can deliver. Because the methodologies are, they're the best we can do, but that doesn't make them perfect. And so these annual changes, I would just be very careful about. Whereas what Dolgyon led off the discussion with, this observation of how since 2019 on VDEM, for example, the score has steadily gone down until last year. That's a 5-year change that does require explanation. And that does require a discussion of what is being captured by the index going constantly down over the past 6 years until this past year. And I think that's a very good question to ask. And then there's methodological answers and there's substantive answers. But what you just referred to, Anand, some of the political events we've talked about for the past almost year of running this podcast, but that we've all been involved in for many years in Mongolia, some of those events are reflected in indices, especially in these longer trends, but probably not in the annual change.
And I think if I may add to this point, countries like Hungary, Turkey, India, that have all like even Venezuela, that have started their democratic decline a while ago, like at least a decade ago, were reflected in the Freedom House Index, for example. Their index was, classification was downgraded from free to partly free, almost like at least 5, 6, 7 years later. So there's a huge lag in these indices. And I agree fully, Julian, with you that we have to look at these trends. And these, of course, there's methodological cautiousness, but also we have to remember that decline or improvements in democracies happen gradually. They don't happen just based on one event, Yes, for example, there could be an overthrow of an autocratic regime, and next day there could be a coup, whatever. But these indices wouldn't suddenly, I guess, read that country fully free or something like that. They would have to look at all other aspects and indicators and sustaining these things. And also the same as with decline in democracy. Like if 1 year there was a crackdown of protests, they won't suddenly be reflected. But if it's continuous and happening over and over again, becoming trend, certainly they will be reflected.
Yeah, so if we take extreme examples, then this is easier. So the score for Mongolia for 1990 changes dramatically. Right? If you look at 1998 versus 1989 versus 1991, then Mongolia's score changes drastically because there's a drastic event that the assessment of which everyone agrees on, not in all details, but first democratic election makes a big difference to democracy indices. So obviously there's a big change, right? There are other moments where change is much more gradual. So if we look at the past 5 years, change has been gradual, or the past 10 years, change has been gradual for Mongolia, not sudden. And then there's another distinction I would make, that some indices are purposefully biased towards stability in how they score, and others are purposefully interested in capturing change. Freedom House generally anchors score changes in legislative changes in big events. That's where Freedom House changes its score, just on how it operates. And that's a bias in a methodological sense, not in a political sense, just to make that distinction, right? These indices are not perfect. So as researchers, we have to make choices. So one choice is to make, right? Do you hope for an index that largely reflects objective structural factors? And then you say, well, unless there's no big event or no big legal change, I can't change the score. Or you create an index where you're interested in also capturing people's attitudes and perceptions of and assessment of something like democracy. And then you run a system that doesn't require a link to a particular event or legislative change, but also tries to capture general attitudes towards democracy. That is one of the, this is a very rough one, and you'd want to look at more details for the methodology, but that would be one of the distinctions between Freedom House and VDEM in my experience of working with them, is Freedom House would, if I would propose a score change, the question would come back as, well, what happened? Give us an event. Give us a change in government, or big demonstrations, or a change in law that restricted freedom or expanded freedom, something like that. Whereas VDEM gives me many questions that say, okay, now take this piece of political deliberation. What is the relationship between civil society and the government? Has this particular piece changed over the past year? Is it the same? How confident are you in that judgment? And then let's add up these different changes on many small aspects to a bigger picture that also tries to capture perceptions of democracy, not just legislative structural change.
I have some few scrutinies or few criticisms about the indices. So I feel like a lot of countries see these scores and then say we are doing bad in these parts. But I see Mongolia trying to improve some of their things on corruption and other democratic, try to stabilize other democratic institutions. But ultimately, what I see as a journalist is that these kind of measures that the government sees and then try to improve upon, they don't really reflect towards what the citizens want. Basically, they don't. They talk about these corruption scandals, like the tampering down on corruption, and then they go after basically against school teachers who barely make ends meet, and sometimes they would get a few small briberies from maybe their parents for maybe helping out their kids, or maybe almost it's almost like a petty crime, but they see that as a corruption indicator. But I don't see that as a good corruption indicator or stopping corruption at all, because those people are in a situation where the system has basically made it so that they cannot excel, they cannot really have a living standard, and they don't these indicators don't really, in my eyes, is that point towards improving these kind of systemic malfeasances. In my eyes, would you agree on that part?
So I just currently live in Cambodia, which is an interesting contrast to Mongolia in some aspects. The government right now is really focused on the goal that by 2050 the country will become a higher income country. As a result, the indices and indicators the government pays attention to are a lot of them are focused on economic indicators, and also those that are measurable and that can bring good press, let's say, to the government's achievements. On the other hand, of course, the people have some of their interests overlap, some don't, whether these high-income national indicators translate to their household livelihoods or not. So that's where they're more interested. So I think it's a very interesting push and pull and whose voices and whose opinions matter the most. Is this the international experts, international communities' perspectives, or is this the people's perspectives that matter the most? And the argument, I think, for democracies is, of course, they should listen to the citizens, and democracies should deliver to the people. And the reason why people see autocracy is not very valuable for people is because they chase things like indicators too much, and see that at the cost of their people. Whereas I feel like if you balance the two, maybe use the indicators as a tool, not as a goal that you want to blindly check the box. But if you use it in the areas where they actually measure what you want to achieve, and you can really compare yourself against your peers, your region, other countries, and make improvements, that's great. I think the issue is, in this case, is the usage issues, not the index themselves.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that point where I think a lot of the citizens, in my eyes, is running toward autocracies, that they seen how democracy is working for them, which is not good in some people. But even though our government or like other governments point out to how our GDP has grown substantially over the years, but people like regular Mongolians don't see that benefit. So they see in their eyes that basically democracy is not working for them. So what is the best option? It is look towards a strong figure who can just get things done easily, maybe like a Chinggis 2.0 or something. That's a lot of.
Wait, are you going to make me sing again by mentioning the unmentionable name? Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, but basically, a lot of arguments about of people like saying like things are not working. So let's have like a one guy who can just clean things up. Let's get rid of all these 76. Now it's 126 crooks who are in parliament now who don't do anything.
There's actually data on this. The Asian Barometer survey, they cover around more than 10 countries in Asia, including Cambodia, China. And I was looking at this data, a bit outdated data from 2018, their alt wave. They have a recent wave that I need to look again. And very interestingly, the average index, to what extent people agree or strongly disagree that government leaders are like the head of a family. We should all follow their decisions. Both Malaysia and Mongolia, majority had strongly agreed to this. Even Mongolia's agreement was even higher than those in Cambodia, although like the statistical difference, etc., is low. So it's very interesting to see that. Whereas when you look at other questions from IRI, International Republican Institute, what is the best form of governance, majority still says it's democracy. But when you break down the values, like, for example, should we follow our decision makers? Should we, if there's disagreement in society, is it good or bad? And harmony of the community, etc. Mongolia is always ranking very responding very traditionally. So that's why my argument in my 2020 presentation was, yes, Mongolians do prefer democracy, and all the institutions look democratic, etc. But culturally, or like in terms of the embeddedness of democracy, it seems a bit shallow and not fully entrenched yet, proven by these year-to-year surveys. It's a large survey covering national representative sampling. So it's a bit concerning to me that people are still responding that they prefer delivery over effectiveness over freedom or deliberation or discussion. etc. I think that's why in recent days, the recent scandals of the Tall River highway and the city mayor of Ulaanbaatar, he kind of matches that image of a go-getter and forget about all these discussions and just deliver. And I always wondered why he's so popular and has millions of followers, and and I think these kind of deep down values shape and encourage these kind of leaders.
And there you go, listeners. You have a teaser for future discussions. As you can tell, this is a topic that we've all gotten animated on and that there's much more to discuss on. Let me, I do have to share one anecdote, but then let me begin to wrap up. And I think the important takeaway on indices, I would emphasize two things. They are a simplification and they are a tool. They can only capture social reality to a certain degree. They cannot do so perfectly. That's the nature of data collection, and that's the nature of an index. No matter how well constructed, it only captures some aspects of reality. And it's important to ask which aspects those are and if those are relevant to another question that you're asking. The other piece is the one that Dorjan just mentioned as well, and you phrased it that it's a tool, not a goal, the index. So that people should think of if Mongolians have a sense, and there'll be different versions of this within Mongolia, of course, have a sense of what democracy means, and that's where they want to get to, then an index can provide some benchmarking on what that is. But scoring high in the index is not the goal that anyone should be striving for. This is where my anecdote comes in. So I was very closely involved with the Freedom House scoring for the past almost 15 years. And various officials and colleagues and scholars know this. This is not a secret. In the 15 years, no one has ever tried to bribe me or to persuade me to lift the score. And I think this is credit to the government. I would have refused anyway, as you could have guessed. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I say with great confidence. And I think the reason people don't approach me with these kind of things is they know, no, I'm not going to agree to anything, right? But I think it shows a little bit that the good use of some of these indices is as a tool, not as an outcome. So in a democracy, there's no sense in boosting your international score for an election if you're not actually delivering what the score measures to the citizenry. So there's my takeaway: simplification and indices as a tool. How about you two?
For me, they're going to hit the nail on the head. I would say that our leaders need to use this as a tool and not as a way to actually govern and actually improve things upon. And then sometimes if they focus too much on making the numbers better, they're not, again, looking at the whole equation of actually making the lives of Mongolians better. In that sense, is that they also need to look at the numbers as a way to improve things and not a way, not an end goal. And I would also say that a lot of journalists need to have a more analytical approach towards indices in Mongolia. But again, that is quite difficult for our media sector to do, as I would like to defend a lot of the journalists here, is that they're overworked and don't really have the resources to do any kind of in-depth research. So that is my American take on the indices.
Mine is, of course, I agree with both of you, but maybe what I would like to see more in terms of indices is we often tend to report on very average and aggregate numbers. We need to see much more, if possible, disaggregated information, data. So what does, let's say, Mongolian supporting democracy mean? Is this all, everyone, or certain groups are supporting, certain groups are opposing? And that trend is continuing. So we need to dig a bit deeper, and most of these indices have like their databases and everything on their websites free to download. So the social scientists and the researchers need to do their jobs and dig and also communicate it better and inform journalists better, rather than just giving one high score. We rank 100th or something. We rank 100th around there every time according to all types of indices anyway. But really looking behind the numbers, looking at the inequalities between what they mean, I think for us should be the next stage.
Okay. With that, we wrap up this episode. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.